Cedo la palabra al maestro Avi Meir, director general de nuestra institución.
Primero vinieron por los socialistas y yo no dije nada porque yo no era socialista. Luego vinieron por los comunistas y yo no dije nada porque no era comunista. Luego vinieron por los judíos y no dije nada porque yo no era judío. Luego vinieron por mí y no quedó nadie para hablar por mí. Así escribió la persona que nos mira desde la fotografía. Esta semana cumplieron 125 años de su nacimiento, Martin Niemöller. Niemöller era un sacerdote protestante antinazi. En la Primera Guerra Mundial, Niemöller fue comandante de un submarino y recibió una alta condecoración. Después de la guerra, estudió teología y desde 1931 hasta su ingreso en la cárcel en 1937, fue sacerdote de una iglesia en Berlín. Al principio, Niemöller promovió a muchos alemanes, dando la bienvenida al ascenso de los nazis al poder, y lo vio como el comienzo del renacimiento nacional. Sin embargo, a principios de 1934, cuando Hitler comenzó a coordinar la iglesia evangélica y sometió al Estado, Niemöller se dio cuenta de la realidad y vio de manera clara el peligro del gobierno nazi. En 1934, Niemöller estableció una asociación de sacerdotes de emergencia para proteger a la iglesia de su intervención de los nazis. Fue uno de los líderes de los círculos cristianos antinazis en Alemania. En 1 de julio de 1937 declararon a él enemigo del gobierno nazi y Niemöller fue arrestado. Fue liberado cuando terminó la guerra. Esta historia nos enseña que cuando escuchamos o enteramos de un acto de maldad o discriminación, no debemos callar. No podemos ignorarlo, ni voltear la cara para el otro lado. El ser pasivo y no hacer nada es participar y dar poder a la maldad, y esta nos vuelve contra nosotros. Por último, quiero citar un versículo bíblico de la historia de Caín y Abel. Después que Caín mató a su hermano Abel, Dios le pregunta: ¿qué has hecho? La voz de la sangre de tu hermano clama de mí desde la tierra. La voz de la sangre de Abel pidió que se escuchan a las voces de las víctimas y se haga justicia con su memoria. Los pido que se pongan de pie y guarden un minuto de silencio en la memoria de las víctimas del Holocausto que fueron masacrados por su religión o por pensar o actuar en manera diferente, y a las víctimas de odio y intolerancia en todo el mundo.
Solicito a nuestros invitados especiales, señor Matshe Yetara, señor Jonathan Peled, licenciado Ronen Weiser, Ludga Simes, padre Daniel Díaz y al ingeniero Mario Becker, suban a encender una vela en memoria de todas las personas que han sido víctimas de la intolerancia. Le pido al señor Jonathan Peled permanezca en el escenario para compartir su mensaje.
Hoy, en el 74 aniversario de la liberación del campo de exterminio de Auschwitz, me presento aquí no solo como el embajador de Israel y el representante del Estado judío, sino también como hijo de padres que lograron huir de Checoslovaquia y que perdieron a una parte menos afortunada de su familia en el campo de concentración de Theresienstadt. Representa un Estado que fue establecido después de la Shoah para asegurar para siempre la existencia y el futuro del pueblo judío en su tierra ancestral, realizando un anhelo milenario que empezó mucho antes de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y que siguió y que se realizó a pesar de la Shoah. Muchas veces el mal se manifiesta primero con la discriminación y el antisemitismo, pero nunca termina ahí. Lo que empieza con palabras de odio rápidamente pasa a la quema de libros y ya vimos lo que sucedió después. Hoy el Holocausto concierne a todos nosotros y su historia tiene un mensaje claro para todos nosotros. A pesar de que hemos pasado o dejado atrás el siglo en que ocurrió, debemos continuar estudiándolo en todas sus dimensiones. Debemos esforzarnos y buscar aumentar la conciencia de las razones que lo ocasionaron y concientizar las consecuencias que tuvo. En el último año hemos visto un alarmante surgimiento de antisemitismo en Europa y en Estados Unidos. Y esto debe servir como un llamado a la acción para todos. Por el lado positivo, se ha visto en las últimas 2 décadas un considerable aumento en la participación de países, gobiernos y actores no gubernamentales en la difusión objetiva de este acontecimiento histórico. La semana pasada se promulgó en Estados Unidos una ley aprobada por unanimidad por el Congreso, el nombre de Elie Wiesel, el fallecido sobreviviente del Holocausto y Premio Nobel. Denominada Acta de Prevención de Genocidio y Atrocidad, GAPA, esta ley establece que la política de los Estados Unidos considerará la prevención del genocidio y otros delitos de atrocidad como un interés de seguridad nacional y una responsabilidad moral. La ley también contempla la capacitación de oficiales de servicio exterior en la prevención de conflictos y atrocidades. Aquí en México también evidenciamos un compromiso y una labor que se manifiesta en la ley contra la discriminación y el racismo, incluyendo al antisemitismo también como delito federal. Habrá que seguir con estos esfuerzos en un entorno cada vez más polarizado aquí en México y en muchos países del mundo. En este sentido, hay que resaltar el rol trascendental de la educación, cuyo propósito principal no debe ser solo recordar al trágico pasado, sino también examinar fielmente el presente e inculcar los valores para un futuro mejor. Nuestro compromiso debe ser recordar a las víctimas que perecieron, respetar a los sobrevivientes que todavía están con nosotros y reafirmar la aspiración común de la humanidad por el entendimiento mutuo y la justicia. Albert Einstein dijo: la vida es muy peligrosa, no por las personas que hacen el mal, sino por aquellos que se sientan a ver lo que pasa. Esto nos obliga a combatir la indiferencia, la apatía y el silencio, y alentarnos a levantar la voz y tomar acción contra toda forma de discriminación, racismo, xenofobia y antisemitismo. Y permítanme una otra última palabra que no he escrito, pero viendo tantos jóvenes y alumnos de escuelas, sí quiero aprovechar que está aquí también mi colega, el embajador de Polonia, para nombrar dos héroes polacos importantes. Uno que creo que ha dado un gran ejemplo porque fue un gran educador, innovador, y me refiero a Janusz Szkorczak, que dirigió un orfanato en Varsovia y acompañó a todos sus niños al campo de concentración de Treblinka. Y otro que ha sido un justo entre las naciones, Jan Karski, que fue también nombrado como ciudadano honorario de Israel por su lucha. Fue un polaco no judío que entró en el gueto y en los campos de concentración para relatar al mundo las atrocidades del régimen nazi, y logró de contarlo y de vivir después en Estados Unidos y ser declarado justo entre las naciones. Agradezco mucho su participación hoy en día. Gracias.
Pido la presencia del señor Maciej Jetara, embajador de Polonia, suba al escenario a dirigirnos unas palabras.
Jóvenes, me honra mucho esta invitación muy generosa para poder participar en la conmemoración de la liberación de Auschwitz. Para nosotros los polacos, la Shoah representa el hecho más trágico de nuestra historia, ocurrida, como ustedes saben perfectamente, principalmente en los territorios ocupados por los nazis, territorios polacos, donde se crearon los campos de exterminio más grandes: Birkenau, Sobibór, Treblinka, Majdanek y otros. Es una herida que no se ha sanado por la historia común entre polacos y judíos, que empezó en el siglo XIV con los primeros asentamientos de los judíos en la ciudad de Cracovia, y que una historia que no terminó porque hay una comunidad judía en Polonia todavía, pero en el 39 era una comunidad de más de 3 millones de personas, la más grande de Europa. Quisiera reiterar, recordar también el compromiso del gobierno polaco por preservar la historia de la Shoah y por preservar la historia de la herencia judía en Polonia, que en cierta forma llegó a ser parte de nosotros. Quisiera decirles que muchos de los científicos, empresarios, artistas más destacados de Polonia eran judíos, como Rubinstein, Tuwim, Wieniawski y tantos otros. Así que Polonia, independientemente de la forma del gobierno, del partido, tiene el compromiso de preservar la memoria de la Shoah, en este momento creando un nuevo museo en el campo de exterminio de Sobibór y creando el Museo del Gueto de Varsovia, que va a ser una nueva posibilidad también de investigar la historia del Holocausto. Y está siendo también muchos esfuerzos desde el regreso de la democracia en el año 89 por recuperar la herencia judía, las sinagogas, los cementerios, las antiguas escuelas judías, para que no olvidemos tanto el genocidio como también esta otra parte que nos sigue uniendo de una forma especial, la historia común de la cultura judía en Polonia. Muchísimas gracias.
Pido la presencia del profesor Francisco Correa, quien leerá el mensaje de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas.
Cada año, en torno al 27 de enero, la ONU rinde tributo a la memoria de las víctimas del Holocausto y ratifica su compromiso de luchar contra el antisemitismo, contra el racismo y contra toda otra forma de intolerancia que pueda conducir a actos violentos contra determinados grupos humanos. El 27 de enero se conmemora la liberación en 1945 por las tropas soviéticas del campo de concentración y exterminio nazi de Auschwitz-Birkenau. La Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas proclamó oficialmente esa fecha Día Internacional de Conmemoración en Memoria de las Víctimas del Holocausto. El Holocausto no solo afectó profundamente a los países donde se cometieron crímenes nazis, sino que también repercutió en muchos otros lugares del mundo. 7 decenios después de los hechos, los Estados miembros comparten la responsabilidad colectiva de abordar los traumas remanentes, mantener medidas que permitan una conmemoración eficaz, cuidar de los lugares históricos y promover la educación, la documentación y la investigación. Esta responsabilidad obliga a educar sobre las causas, las consecuencias y la dinámica de tales delitos, así como a fortalecer la resiliencia de los jóvenes contra las ideologías de odio. Nunca más. Gracias.
A continuación, invito al doctor Bernd Bollschläger, suba al escenario para narrarnos su historia.
Whenever I speak in front of any crowd, I ask myself, what on earth am I doing? Because first of all, I didn't speak about anything for many, many years. I was ashamed. I had problems to connect to my own heart until my son, Tal, who is now 30 years old, asked me at the age of about 14, 15, a very, very simple question. He asked me, Dad, who is my grandfather, Abba mi asabashili. And you would ask yourself, that's a very easy question to answer. Well, that was the root of the problem. It was not easy for me. Because how can I explain to a nice Jewish boy who undergoes complete Jewish education from cradle to high school and college, how can I explain to him that his own father, yours truly, is a Jew, an Israeli, and served in the Israeli army as an officer, and on the other hand, my father, his grandfather, was a highly decorated World War II German tank commander and National Socialist. So to connect these two worlds was very difficult for me until I started to speak, because I had to tell something to my son. I couldn't leave it open. And what I told him is approximately what I'm telling you after so many years. There are, of course, a little bit of changes information that I received, but it's approximately the same story. And I told him the story of my life. And each life, of course, begins with the time and place that you were born in or born at. And I was born May the 9th, 1958, in a gorgeous German city called Bamberg, to use the proper German pronunciation. It's a pearl of history nestled between Würzburg and Nuremberg in the south of Bavaria, actually in the northeast part of Bavaria. And it's a history life. It's never was destroyed by any wars, this city, always preserved, and it's like a living, breathing museum. And in this museum I grew up in, always aware about history. Our teachers very early on in elementary school, they walked us through the city, explained that it was called the Rome of the North, 7 hills, each hill is crowned by a church, and rattling down the names of princes, queens, and the only pope that buried outside Rome. It was soaked with history. But one thing I noticed, not that I was intellectually prepared for that, but one thing I noticed very early on, that something is not kosher. I didn't use that term. But there was a part of the history that was missing. I knew there was a war, and I knew in the war people win and people lose. And the fact that we had about 10, 15,000 American soldiers and family members stationed in that city of 75,000, an essential component of the social fabric, it meant that we didn't win that war. That's all what I knew. But I also knew that something happened in the war that affected my family too. But there's a word in German that characterizes this attitude not to talk about it. It's called Totschweigen, silence to death. And slowly but surely, when I asked my father and my mother about their background, they started to talk. But first, they were not wanting to talk at all. When I asked about my grandparents, father's side and mother's side, I was told they were killed and died because of the war. So something really bad happened and nobody wanted to talk about it. Slowly but surely, though, my father and my mother told me their respective story. And these were very, very different stories. On the one hand, my father, once he started talking and never stopped, he told me on long walks that we had on Sunday afternoons in the forest. He was a hunter. He told me how to handle a rifle, how to fish. We had a very, very close relationship. And he told me over and over again the story of him serving as the youngest tank commander in an elite tank unit under the command of General Guderian, the father of the German Blitzkrieg. And my father served as literally as his personal guide, assistant, and fighter. And every war front that Germany battled on from September the 1st, 1939, the invasion of Poland, the following year, the invasion of Holland, Belgium, France, and of course then in the summer of 1941, in the attack on the former Soviet Union, also called as the Operation Barbarossa, my father's tanks were the first to roll in. And this elite unit pushed forward as far as they could. My father's tanks actually reached the town of Orel and conquered it on the way towards Moscow, which of course the Germans never reached. And for that accomplishment, he was awarded the Knight's Cross by a man who is still adoringly referred to as his Führer, Adolf Hitler. Now, I didn't know anything about history. I was a young boy. I had no reference points. I didn't know. The only thing I knew was my father's obviously a hero. And the fact that my father was considered to be a hero was reinforced by his old war buddies who came to our house at least once a year to celebrate the good old times. Among them, former ranking officers and a general, and the son of Guderian, Heinz Guderian. And I was sitting in this room, in this living room where they all were sitting and bragging and drinking, and I was told, Bernd, you need to be proud of your father because he is our hero. So I thought my father is a hero. No questions asked. On the other hand, my mother told me a completely different story about that war. The war was horror, was catastrophe. Why? She was an ethnic German, a Sudeten German, born and raised in Czechoslovakia along the border region between West Germany and East Germany and the western parts of Czechoslovakia. Born into a very wealthy family, a merchant family. My maternal grandfather was a glove manufacturer. He had plenty of money to build a beautiful villa in the outskirts of Karlsbad, a very protected life. And with the end of the war, all had to flee or were evicted. Many were killed on the flight towards ethnic Germans on the flight towards West. My mother was one of them. She survived and settled in Bamberg together with my father. So the war was horror and the war was glory. So two different stories. And there was something else about my house, or the house that we were living in, which was connected to history. We were living in this massive two-story building in downtown Bamberg. It's still standing if anybody wants to visit. We lived in the ground floor apartment, and the landlady lived upstairs in this huge apartment alone. And whenever I asked my mother who this lady was, my mother referred to her as the Countess, die Gräfin. I should not talk to her unless spoken to, out of respect. And in that hallway, right next to the wooden stairway leading upstairs to the Countess's apartment, was a portrait of a man mounted on the wall, painting, a man in uniform with the Knight's Cross around his neck, the officer's insignia on the shoulder, and the officer's cap on. And his facial features were obviously different to that of my father, because otherwise I would have thought that it was my father. And when I asked my father who this man was, my father referred to him as der Verräter, Haboged, the traitor. Now, I was a little bit confused. How can a man who looks like my father, because I saw my father's pictures in uniform, how can one be good and the other one be bad? Very simple, naive question of a child. Until I found out from the lady upstairs that this was a portrait of her late husband, Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, the German colonel who led the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on the 20th of July 1944, which unfortunately failed. He was executed the same night, and Nina von Stauffenberg was thrown into a concentration camp 2 days later, Ravensbrück, and survived because German officers prevented her to be killed. And her children were given up to adoption, and on the way to Buchenwald, they were captured by the Americans, so this convoy, and they were reunited with their mother. And from her, I heard a completely different story, not because I was intellectually stimulating conversation. She had grandchildren, and whenever the grandchildren came, was a big ruckus in the house, and I sneaked upstairs, playing with them, and in this apartment, this huge apartment, the wall was covered with pictures about her and her husband, a very loving couple. So how can it be that one is bad and one is good? And in school, we started about, when I was 12 years old, we started to talk about the war and the history which led to the war. And we learned approximately the following story. Hitler rose to power in 1933, democratically appointed by his predecessor, Papen, and with the blessing of the president of Germany at the time, Hindenburg. And immediately after that, he began to establish a brutal dictatorship, which of course led to the catastrophe that we call the Holocaust, but also to throwing anybody who is different into concentration camps. And as a result of that war in 1939, the Germans were responsible for the murder, literally, of 60 million people, among them 6 million Jews, as collateral damage of war. Nothing about the Holocaust. And then on the 8th of May, with the capitulation in 1945, all changed. The Nazis disappeared like a group of Huns that invaded and escaped. That was the history. Now, that was, of course, not true. That's the least I can say. This was false and wrong. And then came an event that changed everything in my life, and that's the reason why I'm standing here. The Olympics in Munich, 1972. August 1972. And towards this Olympics, our teachers prepared us to recognize that this is a unique event because you should demonstrate to the world that this is a different Germany. And of course it was a different Germany. It was a Germany that still tainted by the past, slowly recovered, and unfortunately had in this previous political leadership Nazis, among them Kurt Georg Kiesinger, a German chancellor from 1966 to 1969, who was an active member of the National Socialist Party and was a member of the propaganda ministerium of the Nazis. And he was defeated by a man whose name was Willy Brandt, who was totally different to anybody of his predecessors because he was a victim of the Nazis. A socialist who escaped Germany in 1933 and returned to Germany in 1946 or 47, rebuilding his party called the Social Democratic Party, and rose to power in a democratic election in 1969. And he traveled in December 1970 to Poland, and in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, he fell on his knees, bowed his head, and asked for forgiveness for what Germany did. And this picture of the chancellor kneeling in front of the memorial was on the front page of every German newspaper, and we read newspapers at home too. Actually, my father made me read newspapers every single day, asked me questions about what happened. He was a very intellectual man. And I asked my father, what is it with this man kneeling in front of a memorial? And my father yelled and screamed, not again. What a traitor. Not again with them. Look what they did to our country. So the victims as perpetrators and the perpetrators as victims, we have nothing to be ashamed of. And this chancellor, with a great fanfare, opened the Olympics in August 1972. And I remember very well that my parents invited friends over. We had our first TV, black and white though, and there was festive atmosphere, food was served, wine, everybody was drinking, and we were watching the TV, how the teams paraded into the stadium, hooray, hooray, and suddenly a team paraded into the stadium carrying a flag with a star inside. And at that moment, the adults felt silent, as if, as a child I learned, this is the do not ask the question moment. I was a little bit confused. Why do they react like that towards that flag? And I had no idea what it meant. Could have been Sweden, Switzerland, or Norway. I didn't know. And then 10 days later, or 7 days later, the catastrophe happened. The same team that so proudly paraded into the stadium was brutally attacked by a group of Palestinian terrorists, an elite unit of the PLO. We know now that they were guided and provided with information and logistics, probably also with weapons, by the East German security service called the Stasi. And they climbed the Olympic Village defense, attacked the Israelis in their apartments, killed or murdered, brutally slaughtered 2 of them, and the remainder were taken hostage. 1 could escape. And the German government, deeply embarrassed that Jews were killed on German soil and held hostage, dispatched the highest ranking member of the German government towards the Olympic Village. And I remember this picture that one of the senior ministers in the German cabinet negotiated face to face with the terrorist, asking them, begging them to take them, politicians in the German government, leaders of the German government, as hostages in return for the Israelis. They refused. The leader of the gang was Issa. He refused. He demanded that all hostages should be flown out, and they should provide them with a plane, flown out to an Arab country of their choice, and Israel should release from Israeli prisons about 260 or 280 Arab prisoners. The German government had to consent because there was no way out of this logjam. So what they did, they ordered 2 helicopters from the German army, and I remember it beat by beat because it was on live TV. They landed in the Olympic Village, were boarded by the Palestinian terrorists who looked at first that everything was fine, boarded with the terrorists and the hostages, and they flew off to the military airport on the end of, outside of the perimeter of Munich, called Fürstenfeldbruck, and then all hell broke loose. Firefight lasting for at least an hour, huge explosion, fireball above the military airport, and then deafening silence. And then we learned what happened when an American journalist turned towards the TV camera and said, they're all gone. What happened, the German police tried to liberate the hostages. And the Israeli army special unit forces, including the Mossad, were on the ground and said, do not attack them. These are elite soldiers, they're committed, they're fanatics. We need to find another way out. But the German police opened fire. Issa and the fellow terrorists recognized that this is a trap, and he threw a hand grenade in one helicopter, which exploded. All Israelis perished in the fireball. And the next helicopter, they sprayed with machine gun fire, and everybody died. And next day, a picture in the newspaper that shaped the course of my life. 2 helicopters on the tarmac, 1 burned out with the charred remains of the Israelis inside. The other helicopter with the bodies of the Israelis slumped over the seats, barely covered with linen. And a huge headline, Jews killed in Germany again. Now, I speak perfect German, but the part again, wieder, that triggered my curiosity. Is it, what a minute. They were murdered again in Germany. So Jews were murdered before in Germany. And I went home and asked my father, so what happened? My father looked at me and said, das ist alles eine Lüge. It never happened. Look what they did to again to us. Look what they do with our image. They destroyed our Olympics. I was a little bit confused about that. And in school, we started to talk about it for the first time, about the so-called Holocaust. Now, the term Holocaust was not coined at that time. It was later in the late 70s. But we talked about the true history of Germany between 1933 and 1945. And we learned everything. Auschwitz, Majdanek, Buchenwald. The murder of 6 million, not as an accident of war, but as a policy of the German government, democratically elected government, a policy of the government in the name of Germany, so I as a German are responsible too. And I was really shell-shocked because I never heard about it. Some of our teachers cried when they told us this story. And I asked myself, what did my father know? No, what did he maybe do? I didn't want to believe in that, but first of all, I wanted to know what he knew. And when I came home, and I told my father, reported to him what happened, and my father looked at me, you talked about the so-called Holocaust? This is all Jewish propaganda. Your teachers are all communists. It never happened, believe me. So I was caught between a rock and a hard place, understanding who is right and who is wrong. And I respected my teachers and I feared my father. I said, look, somehow I have to find the truth. And I started to read as much as I could about the Holocaust, anything and everything that was published at that point in time from libraries. And the more I learned about it, the more I had a lingering feeling my father's hiding something. And so I decided to ask my father about that time. Now, again, my father didn't want to talk about it, but as a child of an alcoholic parent, I knew that there are 3 phases during the day which I had to very carefully measure. Phase 1, when he was looking for a drink, he was restless, irritable, and discontent. Phase 3, when he was in La La Land, and you couldn't talk to him. But phase 2, I call it the Schicker zone nowadays, it's a joke. And you could approach him, his tongue was loose, you could get things out of him, manipulate him, get money. And in that phase, he started to talk. And what he told me was reluctantly, but it came out in also a few phases. Phase 1, I paraphrase it. Bernd, whatever allegedly happened in the East, we didn't do it. The Wehrmacht didn't do it. It was all the SS. Now that was, of course, a blatant lie, which I found out later on in phases 2. When the lady upstairs, Nina von Stauffenberg, told me, and I met her several times as I was growing up, told me that her husband was badly wounded in North Africa, was assigned to the Chief of Staff office as a colonel, and responsible for the logistics and supply to the Eastern Front, for the troops at the Eastern Front. And he could never figure out why there was not enough train capacity. Of course, he figured out why the Jews transported to the camps. And I found out from my father, not from my father, but when the archives were opened after the reunification of Germany in 1989, that I found a picture of my father sitting next to Heinrich Himmler in 1942 during a conference. And if a German ranking military officer meets the head of the beast of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, this was not about tactics. It was about securing territory for mass murder. Then I found a letter a researcher provided with me, and it is original, I was confirming it, that my father sent about 600 and something Russian prisoners of war, among them officers, on a train accompanied by his assistant to a place called Auschwitz-Birkenau with the final sentence, they deliver the good for neutralization. That means for killing or working them to death. So my father knew about it. And the last but not least evidence I found 3 years ago when I was lecturing in Germany in my hometown Bamberg about that time, when a military historian provided me, after a lecture that I gave, a metal attaché suitcase and said, this is from your late father's the late mechanic from your father's unit, and his family wanted you to have it because you're the son of the commander. In a sick way on the internet, in this group chat rooms of ex and fellow Nazis and new Nazis, I'm being admired as the son of the commander. It's not a great reputation, I'm telling you. And so I opened the suitcase, and inside were ripped pieces of Torah scrolls. And I asked him, what does it mean? He said, well, it means that your father's unit, when it ripped into Jewish villages and killed everybody, they tore out the Torah scrolls out of the synagogue, soaked them into water, cut them into pieces, and used it as insulation material for German tanks in the cold Russian winter. So my father was a murderer. I didn't know that with all the evidence, but I knew it not then. Phase 2, I paraphrase it. My father said, look, Bernd, when civilians were killed, they were all partisans. Geneva Convention doesn't apply. Well, it means you can kill them. It's a rationalization of murder. And I asked him rhetorically, how can it be when 1 million plus children died in the war? Not died, they were murdered. Children ripped out of their parents' arms, burned alive in burning pits. Children hoarded into concentration camps and died in the in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, and the ashes scattered on the killing fields. You'd call that a war? And then phase 3, he was totally blasted. He was drunk one day. And he told me, look, Bernd, what you call the Holocaust, you're weak. You have to be strong because we took care of the dreck in the East. The world should give us a medal of honor because we took care of all the lichluch, the schmutz, the dirt. That was the way he referred to the Jews. And that was the last straw that broke the camel's back in trust that I had with my father. I turned away from him. He was not the hero. He was a common murderer. And I asked myself, what shall I do? And I asked one of my teachers, I presented that question to one of my teachers, a Jesuit priest, former Jesuit priest, and he told me, look, Bernd, you have to make amends. I asked him, amends to whom? Well, to Jews. I said, I don't know any Jews. Said, I will make this happen. He belonged to a progressive wing of the Catholic Church, and they invited once a year Jews and Muslims from Israel to meet in Germany to learn from each other and to build up a dialogue. And I was one of the German members who participated with the recommendation of my teacher. And when young people get together, I was 18, they were 17, just before the army. When young people get together, the last thing that you want to find out is what separates you. I mean, what you like, what music you like, what food you like. I have to admit, in this somber moment, I liked the Israeli girls a lot. So it was not only about spiritual nourishment. So having said that, it's a PG-rated event. But I met one of the girls, we had a wonderful romance, and she said, look, if you want to visit me, tacheles, that's the way Israeli girls are, you need to find a solution to the problem. You come to Israel and you meet my parents. I was a big Schwitzer, a big Macher. Absolutely, I will do that. There was only one little problem. Kein Geld, no money, and no passport. And I got that together, scratched the money together, got my first German passport, and in October Day in 1977, I traveled from Germany across the Alps to Ancona and the Adriatic Sea, an Italian port. And from there I caught a ferry going from Ancona through Piraeus to Haifa. Do not do that. I slept on deck. It was a very cheap trip. And in Piraeus, we reprovisioned. And I sent a telex from Piraeus to Haifa. Imagine, there was no Google, there was no Schmoogle, there was no Facebook. So she waited for me at the harbor, and I, for the first time, set foot on the ground in Haifa. I asked myself a question. Oh God, what will happen if somebody realizes that my name is associated with somebody who murdered Jews? Reasonable fear. Unreasonable, I don't know. And I saw her behind the gate, and she was overjoyed seeing me. She embraced me, said, let's go to my parents' house, to Neve Sha'anan, and we drove up there. And at that time in Haifa, it was a neighborhood, a working-class neighborhood, small apartments, and her parents were waiting outside, inviting me in, taking me. Her father took my suitcase or my rucksack, moving me into the house, pushing me into his apartment, chit-chatting, and the mother too. I had no idea what they were talking about. It was Yiddish. Sitting me down in a chair and talking to me, fine food, everything served, borekas, falafels. And her father looked at me and wanted really to communicate with me without the help of his daughter to interpret. He asked me in broken but still good German, we can speak German too. I asked him, so how did you learn German? He didn't say a word. He just rolled up the sleeve of his forearm, showed me the number tattooed and said, ich war in den Lagern, plural. I was in the camps. And here I was, for the first time in Israel, a German young man, for the first time in a home of a Jewish family, for the first time in a home of a Holocaust survivor. What shall I do? I wanted to sink in the ground. And he put his hand on my shoulder and said, Bernd, don't be afraid. I was liberated in Auschwitz. I survived Auschwitz. I stayed in Germany in displaced person camps for 3 years. And I had to learn that not all Germans were monsters. But I want to know, do they teach you that? Do they teach you about that time? And I honestly told him, probably not enough. So a few days later, he took off from work. He was a foreman in the port of Haifa, a very strong man, and born in Poland, lost all his family in the Holocaust, and took me to Yad Vashem in Yerushalayim, the Holocaust Memorial. And he guided me physically, took me by my hand through the exhibit, and I broke down. I could not process that. It was overload. And in the end, I cried, and he said, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And I asked myself, how can these people who suffered so much relate to me as a guest? How can these people rebuild their lives, rebuild their families, build an old country anew? There's something special about Jews. I want to understand that. And I started to seek for a place where I could find Jews. And I found it. In our hometown, there was a small community of 30 Jews that were all left over from the DP person camps, deep displaced person camps, when they were released into the general population, one would say. And they got businesses licensed from the American Army, and so they built up real estate, banking. It was a very wealthy community. And I knocked at this glass door of one of the building. It was hidden in a courtyard behind the road. And an old man opened the door, looked at me, and said, "Was willst du? What do you want?" And I rambled something, and He let me in. He thought I'm a student who may have a project. And we walked to this corridor, small corridor, covered with black granite plates, and each granite plate was inscribed a name, many names. And I asked him, what does it mean, and what is this red light in the corner? I said, this light in the corner is the Ner Tamid, the internal light, and these names that are listed on the plates are the names of each of the Bamberg Jews, 1,200, who never came back from Theresienstadt. And he led me into his office. It was a hot day, windows closed, curtain drawn, no air condition, no fan. He took off his jacket. He had a very pale skin, and he had a short-sleeved white shirt, and the number tattooed on his skin stood out. And I stared at it because I didn't know what else to do. And he looked at me and said, let's break the ice. This was Auschwitz. I'm from Auschwitz. I'm the chair of the community here. My name is Itzhak Rosenberg. What do you want? I told him my story. He said, that's a very sad story. Take a book and read it. I said, I'd read all the books. So what do you want from me? I want you to teach me about Jews. I said, teach you about Jews? Well, if I be your teacher, we have to make a Geschäft, an essay, a business deal. You will be our Shabbos goy, and in return, I will teach you. Now, for those, most of you don't know what a Shabbos goy is. It's a non-Jewish person, man or woman, that serves, mostly men, who serves in the Jewish community from Friday to Saturday to do all these manual labors that Jews cannot do during Friday and Saturday. So I became a Shabbos goy, and I told me, come on Friday night and be at 6, and I'll show you what to do. I was there at 6, he came at 7:30. I said, what do you do here? I said, you told me at 6. Nah, 6, 7, 8. First of all, Jewish time is different to Yeket time, German time. So, okay, I had to learn that. And then he told me, look, you set up everything, and one important issue, when the members of the community walk in, do not talk to them because they don't like goyim in their little world that they built up. And so when they're coming in, they were hickering and pickering, was macht der Goy, was macht der German there? Itzhak said, they're crazy, they're alte kackers, don't talk, just sit down and be quiet. And so Friday by Friday, Saturday by Saturday, month by month, year by year, holiday by holiday, I went there. And I absorbed the liturgy, I absorbed the language, I absorbed the mannerisms. As closer I came to this community of choice, the more I distanced myself from the community of origin. And of course, it came up to the blow-up in my family. And it was one day where Shabbat fell on a Christmas day. And on Christmas Day, I come from an Orthodox Catholic family. My mother sent me to elementary to Catholic kindergarten, Catholic elementary school, Catholic school. She wanted me to become a priest, which didn't work out. So we had a ceremony for Christmas, which can still run in my head, lentil soup and carb, going to the Holy Mass, coming back. My father was in the living room decorating the real Christmas tree. The bell was ringing. We walked into the Christmas room, so to say. And he had this dark, fine suit with a knight's cross around his neck and sang festive Christmas hymns, and I was not there. The next day I came, all hell broke loose. My father was screaming, my mother was crying, where were you last night? And I had it. I said, look, let's stop the Greek tragedy. I'm going every Friday and every Saturday to the Jewish Community Center to help them because what you destroyed. He looked at me. You are a murderer. Do you understand that? Your hands are washed with blood. And this stained metal thing that you wear around your neck is a sign that you're a murderer. He looked at me. Raus. Get out. There was a little problem for that because in Kesef, no money, kein Geld. Even though I was in the second to last year in medical school and I was on a full scholarship, I had some financial needs. And I never asked for money from the community, but Itzhak must have sensed something and told the others, because for the first time in 5 years, an elderly man approached me. His name was Aaron, who never talked to me. And he looked at me and said, in Yiddish, hör mal zu, listen, deine Jacke und deine Schuhe sind schmutzig. Your jacket and your shoes are dirty. Kaufte neue Sachen, buy new stuff. Gave me 100 mark and disappeared. So I was insulted and got money. So I went to Itzhak and said, look, Aaron did this and this. And said, Aaron gave you money? What's wrong with him? He never talked to us. Did you at least use the opportunity and got 200? No, because you're a goy. So he sat me down here, this wicked humor. He said, Bernd, you have to understand a very important lesson. All of us, after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, that survived, had no emotions anymore. We rebuilt it very carefully. I was successful. Aaron, we don't even know what happened to him. We know from the Red Cross that he's a Jew. We know from the Red Cross that he was in Auschwitz, but he has no family. And Aaron became my friend. He started to talk with me as if I would be a wailing wall. I didn't say a word. And he told me a story that I reluctantly tell you. He was a member of the Sonderkommando. A Sonderkommando was a group of Jews who worked the ovens. And as the ultimate insult to Jewish life and Jewish fate, these members of the Jewish Sonderkommando guided Jews into the gas chamber, told them, don't worry, it's just a shower. Then they closed the door. When the SS threw down the Cyclone B through the openings in the ceiling and gassed people, when the screaming and banging on the door stopped, they went in with gas masks, tore out the body, burned the bodies, crushed the bones, and threw the rest in the pits. For that, they became the best food, women, wine, everything. And 90 days later, the next group came in, and Aaron survived. 6 months later, Aaron died. Probably his last opportunity to speak to me was that day, or these days that we spent together. And I had to come back to Bamberg because Itzhak told me Aaron died and told me, you were his best friends. You will say Kaddish at his graveside. I said, I don't know if I can do that. I'm not a Jew. Itzhak told me, Aaron was your best friend. You're one of us, so do it. So the next day, after we did the Chefa Kaddish, they wanted me to wash the body, help them with that. When the coffin was lowered into the grave, Aaron's graves, Itzhak gave me the Siddur and said, read. And I read it. And then I crossed the line. I knew I crossed the line. And I said, Itzhak, I have no family. I want to be a Jew. Itzhak looked at me as a bad thing. Bad idea. Do you know what happens to Jews? They get the number. Be a ger tzedek, be a righteous person. Don't be a Jew. You tell me daitzoris, he said, too much trouble. I said, I want to be. He said, well, I sent you to a rabbi in Frankfurt, and you pay all the hotel and all the transportation. Don't come back until he talks you out of it. He tried. He didn't. And we came to an agreement. We said, he will teach me, but I will never ask him for conversion. Well, I was something called a nutnik, a little bit persistent kind of guy. And he finally agreed to say, look, you're getting to me. It was in the spring of 1986. I referred to the rabbinical court in Frankfurt. Whatever they decide, I will be one of the members. I will not vote in front of you. I will abstain. So what they decide, it's a decision, good or bad. But until you get there, you have to do some slight changes. One of them includes your physique, a little surgery. I don't want to talk about it. And it had to be done in an Orthodox facility in Switzerland. And then I had to, 2 months later, immerse in an Orthodox mikveh in ritual bath in France. And in November or December 1986, I underwent a halachic Orthodox conversion in German rabbinical court. And it was not a drive-through affair. The most important question I had to answer that the chief rabbi posed was, why on earth a German, for no reason but being a son of a Nazi, wants to become a Jew? Because guilt doesn't count. And I convinced him and them. And they retreated after like a court hearing. They were coming back. I was sitting where you're sitting, not as low. And they were in a podium. The rabbis asked me to stand up, and I was standing up. And they were reading the Teudat Giyur, the conversion certificate, in Hebrew and then in German. It was a very tense atmosphere, and the rabbi asked me, did you choose your first name yet? I said, no. Well, you know what Bernd means? No. It means the bear slayer. You do be Dov, take it, it's free. So I became Dov ben Abraham. I was overwhelmed, and I knew that's it. It's the end of my life in Germany, as we know it. And I applied for the Jewish agency. Actually, the rabbi asked me, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to go to Israel to serve in the army. And immediately applied to the Israeli embassy, to the Sukhnu, the Jewish agency. Within 30 days, I was approved as a so-called Oleh Chadash, new immigrant. Got a visa for a one-way ticket stamped into my passport, a ticket with El Al from Frankfurt to Tel Aviv. And in January 1987, I left Germany for good. I tried to talk to my family. Itzhak told me, you have to talk to your family. You have to say goodbye, because now you're a Jew, you have to follow the laws. And I tried to speak to my father. He was drunk. He's sitting in his apartment, in his study in the house. My mother was yelled and screamed at by him. She cried, and I left. And so I arrived in Tel Aviv in the nighttime. There was this old airport. There was the reception hall for new immigrants. There was only me and somebody else. and a very bored bureaucrat, and he said, what do you want? Give me the paperwork, new immigrant, kol hakavod, kibbutz. That was easy, I thought. So in the night I took a bus and went with a little bit of money, went to the kibbutz. 6 months I stayed in the kibbutz. It's a community settlement, very wealthy kibbutz, Kibbutz Magan Michael. And from there, after 6 months, I picked bananas. If anybody's interested in questions about bananas, I know it all. 6 months later, I was assigned to a hospital in downtown Tel Aviv to get my German license up to Israeli par. And then, of course, I was drafted in the Israeli military a short while later, did my basic training officers course, was assigned. It was the first month of the first month of the first Intifada in 1988. And I was assigned to this place called Ramallah and Beit El. It was hell on earth. And I was standing there with my commanding officer in my uniform, officer's insignia on the shoulder, a little young lieutenant, and in front of a unit where my commanding officer said everybody was in full battle gear, including me. This is your new doctor. His name is find another name. And he is responsible, so that's it. And here it hit me hard. And I asked myself, if they find out that I'm a son of the Nazi in drag, they will kick me out of there. They will throw me into the village, into the city of Ramallah. I decided not to talk about my life, to throw my life in this virtual closet, slammed the door shut, turned the key in the lock and throw it away. People knew only that I'm a Jew, I made Aliyah, was born in Germany, my name is Bernd, that's all. Of course, that was a lie. And I lied, which I'm not proud of. And then I married in Israel. I raised a family after the first Gulf War, in which in January 1991, when Israel was attacked by ballistic missiles, I was outside with a rescue unit of the military. And my wife literally got very upset and was stressed out. She said, look, I want to go back to the United States. Come with me or stay here. So we left, arrived in Miami, not a bad place, by the way. And our marriage didn't work out. 3 children were born, and I had my children there, and I couldn't bring them with me, so I decided to stay and work in Miami. And the years passed by until my son, Tal, asked me this simple question. Dad, who is my grandfather? And I answered him. And my son looked at me and said, cool, I will tell it to my friends. I said, no, that stays between you and me. There was just a little problem. My children, as I told you before, went to Jewish schools, and he went to a Jewish school called Hillel, and they had a family history day. My luck, and 3 or 4 months later, my son raised his arm and proudly declared, and my grandfather was a famous Nazi. That's not good in a Jewish school. Don't recommend that. And I was called to the principal's office, and the principal looked at me and said, Dr. Wolschläger, your son Tal told us a verdrehte Geschichte, a completely confusing story about your father was a Nazi. What's wrong with him? I said, there's nothing wrong with him. I told him the story of my life. And the rabbi was sitting in the room. He looked at me. Are you ready to talk about it? Not, I mean, to us, to others. It's important. I said, I can't. You will. Took me by the hand to the class, my son's class, and here I started to talk. And in that moment, the weight was lifted off my shoulders. And I asked myself, why did I never close this circle of life that opened so many years ago? I have to go back. And I went back to Germany 20 years later, to Bamberg, took my son. Cold December day, we visited my parents, and the only place I knew I could visit them, the cemetery. And ironically, in this old 1,000-year-old town, the Jews were integrated in society, so there was a common graveyard separated by the wall, one for Jews and one for Christians. And my parents' grave, if you go to Bamberg, is right next to the wall that separates the Jewish cemetery to the Christian cemetery. And when you look from my parents' grave towards that wall, you see on the other side the Jewish gravestones almost defiantly casting their shadow. And I was all choked up. I didn't want to know what to say. And I told my son, look, it's a symbol. My parents never dealt with the past, and the past still haunts them in death. Cast shadow on their gravesides. I learned to step out of the shadow, look back, to decided never to repeat these mistakes again, moving forward as a German with the responsibility not only to change my life, but hopefully to influence others, that we never have murder and genocide again. And that's what I did. And that's what I'm doing. And I learned some very essential lesson from my father. You probably didn't want to teach me. That words of hatred have consequences. Because words of hatred that left unchallenged fall on a fertile ground, the mind of others. And they sprout into deeds. And if these deeds left unchallenged, they form habits. If these habits prevail, then characters will be formed. If these characters dominate, then a society will be changed. And that explains, but never excuses, that an entire nation, the Germans, turned around and turned away when Jews were murdered because it was normal. Now, no Germans, no problem is not the solution because it's not a German issue, it's a human issue. It's the way we are wired. Now, therefore, to realize that, the best way of genocide prevention is to speak up. To speak up against Nazism, to speak up against hatred, misogyny, hatred against minority groups. If they're black, yellow, or white, whoever cares, you have to speak up. If you don't speak up, you're part of the problem, not part of the solution. And I learned my lesson. And why I'm telling this story? Because I want to reach out to many people as possible. I have a healthy ego. I'm not doing that out of self-aggrandizing. I don't have to do that. But I'm doing it because I want to help others to understand this is not a German problem. Never was, never will be. And the German people have not only learned their lesson, they have actively translated that in supporting Jews over and over again in the past, helping Israel financially, helping Israel militarily, and inviting more than 100,000 Soviet Jews after the fall of the wall. Israel didn't like that too much. To come to Germany and gave them employment benefits, social benefits. That's what Germany learned. No country in the world has ever done that. No country in the world. So the Germans is not the problem. It's us. And we're living in very, very dangerous times where people tend towards authoritarian rule, looking for the leader, somebody who tells the truth, because the truth in the newspapers is all a lie. That is the dangerous time. Rise of anti-Semitism in America is 50%. We have hundreds of hate groups, hundreds of them. And the question is what we do. We tell this story. We tell people, this will lead to the abyss. Let's fight it before we get there. So again, against all odds, change is possible. And I hope that you will be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And if you have any question, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you very much. Shalom, shalom.
Ahora vamos a dar la palabra a quienes deseen formular una pregunta.
How did what my parents did or my father did shape my childhood? Well, you have only one father, and this father was a murderer. How do you feel about that? Horrible. I lost a father. I lost a father in guiding me through life, not only with his stories. I didn't have that, so I bounced off the rubber ball. I did some crazy things. I was actually drinking too. I was getting involved in drugs. And thanks to God, to a good rabbi, he said, this is not the solution of the problem. The solution is in you. You can respect your father, but you don't have to. You can separate the physiological, biological father and the father that he did, what he did to Jews. You have to come back to your roots. And it helped me tremendously. So when I look back today, I don't look back in anger. I know my father, before he died, he wrote his final will, and it's written there explicitly. This man called my son is not my son anymore. This man who is called my son is not allowed to participate in my funeral. This man who called my son is dishonored. He's a traitor. So I found another father, and I found another mother, in a sense of people that loved me, hugged me, and in Israel specifically, didn't make any big fuss about it that I'm a son of a Nazi. Now, I didn't tell many, as I told you, but I told some. Thank you for the question. Very, very good question.
Do you think that after all of this time, you've forgiven your father or not?
That's a great question. If I ever, after all this time, forgive my father. I can tell you for sure that I wanted to desecrate his gravesite. I wanted to rip up the gravestone, want to make it, express my hate in the most single form. And I wanted to, I don't tell you exactly what I wanted to do, but I hated him. And with the good help of a rabbi, he said, you cannot hate because this is against what you learned and what you committed yourself to do. You have to say some words and disengage from your father or reproach it in a loving, caring way. I thought, is he crazy? So what I learned is to separate what my father did to others, which I cannot forgive him for, what he did to me. So individually, I forgive him what he did to me, but I cannot forgive him for what he did to others. That is another that's above my pay grade, that somebody else will do that for me. Thank you.
Okay, so my question is, why did you decide to become Jewish? Like, don't you think you could have expressed the same, like the same thing without being Jewish? Like, why was it important for you to become part of the Jewish religion?
Great question. Well, it was definitely not gefilte fish, because it's the only thing I regret ever to have learned to prepare. I will not eat that ever again. I will stop there. Why I became a Jew? Because Judaism is not only a religion for me. It's a home, a culture, a language, an ethnicity, a way of life that I embraced, that I immersed myself into over the course of 7 years. And it shaped me. It shaped me more because I couldn't connect to my religion of origin, Catholicism, because it was for me too cold. Not that against Catholics, but there was a lack of emotion. You find a lot of emotion and emotional connection within the Jewish life. And therefore, it's with a conviction and not with a guilt. Guilt motivated me to enter. Conviction motivated me to cross the line. And I never regretted it. If you do that for 7 years, you never regret it, because my conviction was so strong that I said, I am a Jew, and I want to be a Jew, and I am a Jew. And I never regretted that, except the affair with the gefilte fish.
How's the way that you live without, and how you make to accept you in both ways?
That's a very, very good question too. I couldn't, and I can't. I couldn't for a long time, and now I can. Because as the Talmud told us in Elie Wiesel, this quote that you saw on the screen, the sons are not responsible for the sins of the father. That doesn't whitewash me. I have to live with that on this burden. On the other hand, I do something proactively that it never happens again. I pretty much speak all over the world. I pretty much speak to any group I want to listen. And the most interesting part, I spoke to a group, once in the United States last year, I spoke to a group of college students who were very hostile, belonging to the BDS movement, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Unit. And they accused me of, God forbid, everything. I try to be and educate. That is what my obligation is. And I will do that until I die. Because it is important to understand that against all odds, everybody can change. And this is, I make the point, I'm just one person. I belong to the German people. That doesn't make me a murderer. And it doesn't make any German a murderer, unless they were, because you judge them as individuals. The same thing among Muslims. I'm not talking about Muslims, them. I talk about them as individuals. I meet with Muslims in Israel. I have in the Galil, in Arab villages, a very good friend living there. I go there regularly because I want to understand. We need to break out of this amorphous approach saying the Jews, the Muslims, them and us. We need to build bridges that one can learn to listen. And I always tell those who I speak to, put the cotton out of your ear and put it in your mouth and listen. Listen what other people have to say. And listen also that, and therefore, so I'm so proud to be a Jew and an Israeli, that Israel is a unique experiment. Unique experiment which never happened anywhere, at least not in the recent past, where Jews and Arabs live together, for good and bad, but we live together. And this, what we learn from each other, we learn individually. If I work as a physician in a hospital in Israel, I mostly work with an Arab physician, that's for sure. In anywhere, in Arab patients, I learn from them and they learn from me. This is not big newspaper postings and Facebook postings. This is a simple, humble, one-on-one relationship. And it works. 70 years long in Israel, it works. Ever been in Tel Aviv? And so the mosques on the bayside, it's colored in green. At night is a green light. And you hear the prayer of the muezzin calling for prayer. And Jews going to the, not religious though, going to Yaffo and eating fish in Arab restaurants. So individual connection, this is the only way it works. Therefore I can live, on the one hand, having the unfortunate heritage that my father provided and the opportunity to change. Against all odds, change is possible with anything, with anybody.
We're going to accept 2 more questions.
With all your experience, I want to know what are your vision and your position about the actual problems and conflicts that are happening around the world in this moment.
Well, that's an easy question. You have 2 hours? No. It is a horrible situation to witness the conflicts of the world which have one major headline, genocide. What happened in Syria? The United Nations stopped counting at 500,000 because obviously there's no more number up. That's called genocide. And we don't recognize it as genocide. What happened in places in Africa, in murder of entire tribes, in Somalia, in Sudan, it's horrible. It's called genocide. In any intent to wipe out people because they belong to a certain group, it's called genocide. And we can go on and on and on. We're living in very dangerous times. The only hope that I have why I commit myself to come here and to other places is young people need to understand you have the choice not to perpetrate this madness, this craziness. And the only way to do it is to fight against people that want to de-individualize, depersonalize people, because that leads to demonization. So it's easy to say, I hate, but it's far more difficult to reach out and talk and build bridges. So I'm hopeful, I'm actually very optimistic. People say he's a little bit cuckoo. I'm very optimistic about the state of Israel, for example, because we are stronger than ever economically, militarily. We're in the best position that we ever could. Arab countries of the most radical conservative countries sent delegates to Israel. Had never happened. So we are strong and positively thinking it will move on. We will prevail and we will teach others and we will stop these genocides in the world. Hopefully in my lifetime, definitely in your lifetime.
Did you ever meet any Jew that judged you for being the son of a Nazi? Or did you ever have some trouble with that?
99.9% of the cases, I never had any trouble. Actually, when I did my miluim, you have a lot of time when you do reserve duty sometimes, and you're sitting in some hole somewhere in God forbidden earth. I had one of the situations where one of my soldiers told me, let me understand that. You converted to Judaism? Not normal. You made Aliyah? Not normal. And you fight in the Israeli army? You're one of us. And even today, when I now tell my patients my story, I said, I heard a story, mostly Israelis, that you were doing this and this and that. How do I sign up to your practice? Because I want to be with you. Of course there are exceptions, and I have to respect them. I humbly respect them. Holocaust survivor. I had a very tragic events that they went through, and I had they have difficulties to connect to Germans. But I had to just to listen. My task is not to talk, is to listen. And I have to respect their opinion about me. But 99.9%, no problem at all. Okay. In this question?
One last question. How do you feel when you went back with your parents and said goodbye? And after that, were you
And after that, I was what?
Were you proud about it?
No, I'm not proud about it. It was just something I had to do. I had to draw the line between what was in the past and what's in the present. But being responsible enough and honest enough to recognize that that I'm still my father's son. I can never run away from that, but I can be different. So I felt relieved, not proud, committed, not proud, and committed to help my children to understand. And my children are the biggest cheerleaders. Said, Dad, well, you have to travel to Mexico. You better go there. They are wonderful, and they understand. For them, it's actually something unique. They said, I'm an Israeli, my grandfather was a Nazi. Go figure that out. That's what children are, but they're not children anymore. Thank you very much.
Invito a Ariel Weisleder y a Mónica Nudelsteger a hacer entrega de un presente para el Dr. Bernd.